So last night, the Kings played here, won 121 to 118, a very close matchup. I think that's literally how the matchup is going to go with Sergei Pavlovich and Tom Aspinall. It's going to be very close, right down the line. Now look, they're prepared and not prepared at the same time. Let me explain exactly what I mean by that. For one, you got to take into consideration the years that these guys have put in to be where they're at. Now, it's not the conventional way of, let's say, getting ready, meaning that they didn't have a 6-week camp, a 12-week camp, as what Tyson Fury would say when he went into the Francis Ngannou fight. I mean, he really put his all into that. And sometimes, you know what? Maybe that is the problem. The problem sometimes is that you can overthink it, and then on top of that, you can also overtrain, which, by the way, is a serious problem when you go into a fight. See, one of the biggest problems that a lot of athletes have going into a fight, a matchup, a game, is that sometimes they overcompensate, sometimes they overtrain. And that in and of itself is a serious problem when you're trying to peak into your time of competition. Now, Michael Bisping said something to the effect where, you know what, it's not about what you did for 2 weeks, for 3 weeks, maybe even 6 weeks, or even 12 weeks of preparation. What it's really about is what you've done your whole entire life in a sport that you've dedicated your life to, and how you're going to execute what you've always been doing your whole entire life. So that's sort of what we're going to expect for this fight with Sergei Pavlovich and Tom Aspinall. Now, here's the interesting thing that I found about this whole entire week. The psychology of these guys going into this fight, which I find really fascinating. Why do I say that? Well, for one, you got to take into consideration that Sergei Pavlovich was getting ready for John Jones and Stipe Miocic, meaning he was the backup fighter in case one of them got injured. Obviously, here we are. Stipe didn't want to fight anybody other than John Jones, and you can't blame him because he's the bigger name. And then these two guys that you have with Tom Aspinall and Sergei Pavlovich. Now, if you're a hardcore MMA fan, guess what? You know who these guys are. You know they're extremely dangerous, and you know they're very talented. The problem is they don't have that big marquee name like John Jones. So if you're Stipe Miocic, who's already doing great with his life at working as a fireman and already a former world champion at that, it's not the highest motivation in the world for you to want to get in there. So by the time this fight is probably going on, Stipe is probably going to be somewhere in Cleveland, Ohio, saving people from fires and whatnot, and he's going to be all right with that. You know, that's just what he, that's just the kind of life that he lives, right? You know, he's not concerned about being a world champion. He's not concerned about the clout or anything like that. But when it comes to the fighting aspect of it, he doesn't want to risk anything to somebody that really means nothing to the casual fan base. So here we are. Here's some interesting psychology that I picked up during this week. So during the Michael Bisping and Tom Aspinall fight, the scrum, he mentioned something to the effect where, you know what? I'm going to be champion one day. It may not be this Saturday, but somewhere down the line. Now, why is that a red flag for me? I'm going to tell you why. For one, you got to take into consideration that most guys that are fully confident in what it is that they do, they will tell you, you know what, I'm the best in the world at what I do, and no one's going to stop me from doing it. And they're going to be very definitive about it. Now, there's nothing wrong with being a little bit humble about it, but here's the thing, right? People who've never competed in professional sports or never competed in any fighting sport or any combative situation or anything like that, one of their biggest issues is that they misjudge a lot of things. Okay, because they don't see it from their perspective. So when they see a guy saying that I'm the best in the world, I'm the greatest at what I do, or this and that, they often mistaken it for cockiness. And it's not. It's really not. Now, from my perspective, why is it not? Because For one, you got to understand, right? You are in a sport where it is extremely dangerous, where somebody could go out and absolutely hurt you. So having a sense of uncertainty when you walk in a cage, when you walk in a ring, or when you walk in a wrestling mat or any field of competition, it's a serious problem if you don't believe in yourself. If you don't, then guess what? The next guy is going to believe more of himself more than you, and he's going to take advantage of that. Now, that's not always the case. You look at Georges St-Pierre, the greatest of all time to ever do it. He wasn't always the most confident guy in his fights or his matchups or his upcoming events, was he? In fact, he was quite nervous in most of his competitions prior to the competition. I'm talking about hours before he would go throw up in the locker room. He would have these mini seizures going on because he was so nervous. But guess what? When he walked in there, he was an absolute lion. So once again, you can't take too much from that. But for me, the way that I see it is that Tom Aspinall psychologically was never really completely sure of himself, and with good reason. He was very underdeveloped as a heavyweight because it was only in this recent time where he really started training with heavyweights, legitimate heavyweights. And why is that important? Because I've mentioned this in the previous content. It's important because you have to get the timing in. You have to understand the impact that these guys are going to bring, as opposed to, let's say, lighter guys that, well, they will test you with your speed, and you've seen the type of speed that Tom Aspinall is able to produce in the cage. But the problem is that he also needs to understand the impact of what it feels like to get hit by a heavyweight. And if you've sparred with heavyweights, with bigger guys that are over 200 pounds, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's a world of difference. So now he has that intact. Yet, even with all that, he's still not as confident. You know who's really confident, that has no bones about his particular ability and what he can do? You know who that is? It's none other than Khamzat Chimaev. You ask this guy if he's going to be world champion. He has no doubt in his mind he's going to be world champion. You ask this guy, hey, if you go and you fight, who's the champion right now, Sean Strickland, how would you do against him? He says, no problem, I would smash him. In fact, he's already been in the cage with him in some form of degree in a sparring session, kind of understands what he's dealing with in there. Now, of course, everybody's going to make these assumptions. Well, he didn't look too good in a Kamaru Usman fight or this and that. Guys, what do you expect? Kamaru Usman is a world champion, and not only that, he's a big 170 fighter who should have been fighting at 185 at some point of his career. And guess what? He did exactly what Kamaru Usman does, and he went in there and gave Khamzat the biggest fight of his life, as he should. So why are people giving Khamzat all this flack about, well, you didn't finish him or this and that? Of course he can finish Kevin Holland. Is Kevin Holland anywhere near the level of Khamzat Chimaev or Kamaru Usman? Of course he can finish Tony Ferguson if he was to go in there and fight him. Of course he was going to blow Nate Diaz out the water if he was going to go in there with him. But there are levels to this. And I think right now that Tom Aspinall, in his case, has a little bit of a hesitation in trying to understand these new skills that he has trying to fight it at the championship level. By the way, Sergei Pavlovich is no walk in the park, not by a long shot. What you're going to get out of Sergei Pavlovich is absolute power and absolute knockout prowess in levels that Tom Aspinall has never seen. So that kind of tells you why, maybe why, he's a little bit insecure about going into this fight. So, of course, he's not saying that he's insecure. You guys are never going to know that. You guys are never going to understand that, or he'll never reveal that to the wider public. But what you can expect out of Tom Aspinall is that he is going to come in this fight a whole lot more careful, and he's going to be very meticulous in how he's going to string together his attacks. Meaning that in his previous fights where you've seen him get knockouts and submissions and whatnot, and he went for the finish, it's not the same as with this fight. This is heavyweight championship at the highest level, and Sergei Pavlovich belongs here. So does Tom Aspinall, but they're going to go about it in a different way. but the psychology of this whole entire thing really plays into a factor. So why am I making a video about Tom Aspinall's psychology and his sense of hesitancy and his sense of, let's say, I don't know, insecurity going into this fight? Why am I just talking about him and not Sergei Pavlovich? Well, let me tell you why. Because this is one thing that I noticed about Sergei Pavlovich, like you notice with most Russian fighters. They're not going to give you a whole lot of information in terms of what it is that they want to reveal to the world, in terms of their temperament, in terms of how they're going to approach the match. In fact, that is pretty much the quintessential Russian way of combat sports and athletics, is stoicism, not revealing too much. However, it was quite interesting, though, that what I got out of Sergei Pavlovich was a story that he had mentioned during this week where he grew up fighting. He grew up in a town where if you didn't fight for yourself and you didn't fight for your right to exist, people are not going to hang with you, people are not going to respect you. Basically, jailhouse rules in that aspect. So this is the kind of guy that Tom Aspinall is dealing with. And it was also interesting, too, that Sergei Pavlovich mentioned that he wasn't always the biggest kid growing up in Russia, right? Which is quite interesting because you look at the guy, he's a monster of a human being. The guy looks like he's built out of a rock, and then on top of that, he has serious knockout power, Ngannou level knockout power, and here we are. So it's quite interesting to see that, because sometimes when we look at these monsters, whether it's Khamzat Chimaev, whether it's, you can even look into fictional worlds such as Ivan Drago, whether it's Francis Ngannou, you look at them and let's say you know nothing about the sport, you know nothing about their biography, they just look like some of the scariest guys in the world. But then when you really look down in the surface and you look down in their history, they didn't become one of the scariest human beings in the world out of nowhere, right? They literally had to go through certain adversities in life in order for them to, I guess, become who they are, right? I don't think people automatically just become monsters overnight or become a beast of a thing just by being born that way. I think that, yes, there are proper genetics that propels that, but more importantly, it is really the environmental factors that hones you into that person, that really molds you into that scary human being that is just an absolute menace to anybody that walks across them. So how I see this particular matchup, I just think that it's going to go to a decision. I don't see any of these guys getting a finish because they are at the highest level that they can be right now. Sergei Pavlovich had an entire training camp to get ready. Maybe something like that is highly conducive for him. When it comes to Tom Aspinall, he didn't really get ready for this fight in the way that you would conventionally get ready for, let's say, a 6-12 training camp. What you got is a fresh guy who's not overtrained, and you can ask Michael Bisping about this when he won the title against Luke Rockhold, when Luke Rockhold was supposed to go in there and fight Chris Weidman for a rematch, and then in comes Michael Bisping from a movie set, just did nothing but run his whole entire camp for that particular fight, or if you want to even call that a camp, he was shooting a movie. Off to the movie set and into the cage, he wins a world title and fulfills his dreams as the first British middleweight champion of the UFC and the first ever UK champion of the UFC, period. And then in came Leon Edwards for the second time of their country to have somebody like that, now possibly Tom Aspinall. So I already gave you the prediction of this fight in the previous content. Here's what I will say right now. Morning, how you doing? You good? Doing a little podcast. Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this in the outdoors, right? Usually you would see me either in my office or in a car doing this, but it's kind of great having the music around you, this serene feeling, talking about fighting while talking about the Sacramento Kings' victory last night against the Blazers with a very close game. By the way, if you guys are ever around here in the downtown area of Sacramento, please watch out for the traffic and the parking if there's a Kings game going on in town. So, yeah, it's going to be really interesting how they're going to come about with the two different psychologies and the two different contrasting preparations that these two guys have going into this fight. But I already gave you my prediction on that. I just think that Tom Aspinall is the much more well-rounded fighter, but at the same time, Sergei has that Deontay Wilder, Francis Ngannou knockout power where any mistakes that he makes all throughout the fight can be compensated somewhere down the road with just one shot to end it all. And I'm going to end it right here. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Inshallah.